Good afternoon. This is Rich Butel, and I'm here with respect to our program on the emerging landscape for VARs and resellers as technology improves across the federal enterprise. And on behalf of the Baroni Center at the Costello School of Business of George Mason University, good afternoon for our program. Our workshop will have two panels going forward. The mission of the Baroni Center is to serve as a neutral, fact-based, and empirically researched resource for the federal acquisition community. Months ago, we took note of the increasing controversies surrounding the proper roles of VARs and resellers in the federal enterprise. So we decided to undertake a major research project on the challenges confronting VARs and resellers. You can find our full report on our Baroni Center website. In our research, we sought to address such questions as, to what extent are federal agencies buying fewer standalone products and more continuously delivering capabilities, cloud services, software subscriptions, cybersecurity platforms, data services, and increasingly artificial intelligence? Should major VARs now deal directly with government rather than using channel partners? In the attempts by agencies to eliminate price dispersion for IT products and services across agencies, how does government avoid lock-in and the loss of innovation from small and non-traditional players? How should the government distinguish substantive integration from routine order processing? We saw that federal policymakers are simultaneously demanding greater speed and greater accountability. Agencies want commercial solutions delivered faster, with fewer layers and less administrative friction. At the same time, contracting officials and oversight organizations are examining price variation, reseller margins, opaque rebates, and the possibility that some intermediaries operate as little more than paper primes. We concluded that the governing principle should be functional rather than categorical, not whether a company calls itself a VAR, but what it actually contributes beyond the underlying product or service offering. The successful VAR of the future may need to provide multi-vendor architecture, cybersecurity engineering, DevSecOps integration, supply chain assurance, compliance documentation, lifecycle management, operational telemetry, and a clear path from pilot deployment to production at scale. In a portfolio-driven acquisition environment, it may also be judged by time to field, adoption, resilience, and mission performance, not simply by whether an order was processed correctly. This afternoon, we have two panels, and we're going to discuss the changing expectation and challenges confronting VARs and resellers across the federal enterprise. Our first panelists are uniquely situated to explore the perspectives of government agencies, large and small OEMs and resellers, channel representatives in a developing and rapidly changing acquisition landscape. Our first panel will focus on VARs and their specific value propositions, emerging attitudes towards VARs, and the proper balance of oversight and evolving contract management perspectives from government agencies. Our second panel will focus on resellers and the attributes and often misunderstood duties that this market channel brings to bear in dealings with federal agency buyers. Let's identify the landscape for the first panel on VARs, and then I want to introduce our panelists. The term is so misunderstood across industry and government alike that earlier this summer, the GSA published a request for information asking industry what their perspective on what exactly comprises a VAR. And it was great to hear Laura Stanton debrief us on that RFI, who responded and what their perspectives were. Our research has shown that the acronym is rapidly evolving as fundamental changes occur to the basic procurement models, and these new procurement models proliferate across the board. Whether it be the transition of government requirements from a goods-oriented system to a services-based framework, to the movement towards enterprise-wide contract consolidation and the mandatory use of innovative procurement techniques, the velocity of change across the entire federal acquisition framework has hit the traditional VAR reseller model in many different ways. We have an unusually well-positioned VAR panel to examine these questions from the perspectives of government policy, enterprise technology leadership, and the OEM marketplace. Our first panelist is Michelle Miller. Michelle is the Director of Contract Policy, Defense Pricing, Contracting, and Acquisition Policy at the Department of War. Working with Johnson Aglia, Michelle oversees the development and maintenance of defense contracting policy and previously held senior procurement policy and operational contracting positions with the Army Contracting Command, and the Marine Corps Systems Command, as well as others. Her background makes her particularly well positioned to address the practical intersection of pricing policy, contracting officer judgment, innovation, and warfighting outcomes. Our second panelist is Tony Scott. He is the CEO of Intrusion.com. Tony was the former federal chief information officer. He served as the third federal CIO with government-wide IT responsibilities for management, modernization, and cybersecurity responsibilities. Tony has held senior technology leadership positions at Microsoft, General Motors, and VMware, giving him experience on both the enterprise buyer and technology provider sides of the marketplace. I had the privilege of working with Tony some years back when I was on the Hill, and he was in that role. Our third panelist is Professor Jessica Tillipman. Jessica is the Associate Dean for Government Procurement Law Studies at the George Washington University School of Law. Jessica is a leading authority on government procurement law, procurement integrity, anti-corruption and compliance, and the governance of artificial intelligence in public sector contracting. Her recent work has examined the risks of accelerating AI procurement without adequate oversight, the hidden costs of promotional AI arrangements, and weaknesses in the federal acquisition workforce. I welcome all of our panelists on this lovely summer afternoon. Starting with Michelle, I'm going to ask each panelist to provide a brief summary of their perspective. Then we will move to Q&As for the remainder of the session. Upon conclusion of our first panel, we'll take a short break before beginning the second panel. Michelle, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and the gavel is yours.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm probably going to disappoint a few people when I say this, but from a policy perspective, the answer on a lot of what we are talking about today really does come down to it depends, which is a very standard both contracting and law answer. I see Professor Tillipman giggling, but we really do. So you mentioned at the outset that VARs is not defined, and in this particular instance, that is, I think, in the current environment, a benefit to us that we have not defined it. We have not drawn a box around it. We have not said it is this or it isn't this. And that's important because in the current environment especially, we are trying to encourage our contracting officers to think critically about the problem sets in front of them. We are trying to ask our program managers and our other people who have requirements within the department to define the requirements in ways that they are looking at what is the eventual outcome or the end state that we want to get to for the government, rather than saying it is X, Y, or Z, and we can put it in a box and we can say it is this thing and it's not that thing. I think since this landscape is changing dramatically as we move through this process, and will continue to do so, and I know some of our other panelists will talk a little bit more about what's changing in that landscape, but from our perspective, looking at it and making policy that contracting officers are going to implement and that acquisition professionals across the department are going to follow, it is important for us to leave as wide an aperture as possible for people to make those judgment calls. And within that, what we are trying to do is provide guidance that allows people to figure out where within the specifics of what they are trying to accomplish or what outcome they need, they can set the appropriate right and left limits for what does add value and what does not add value. And I think the answer to that question is going to be distinctly different in almost every instance. So while I think we can give general guidance to the workforce to explain to them what types of things they might want to look for, we can provide them with examples of things that have been considered to be value add within a particular context. I think we are definitely leaving this currently open to it depends on the situation and the specific characteristics for each purchase that's going to be made under various different contracts. I can't hear you. I'm not sure if it's just me.
We'll reserve questions to the very end. Tony, I'm curious what your perspective is.
Well, I too also am a lawyer, so it depends is a very familiar answer to a lot of questions. But what I'd say is, I've had the benefit of working across a lot of, private sector companies. You mentioned a couple of them, and also, being the federal CIO. And what I would say is that the same issues that we're dealing with here with federal procurement exist in every single large enterprise, and specifically the ones that I'm most familiar with. These are challenges that are pretty much universal. A couple of things come to mind, though, that I think contextually have to be sort of well understood before you can even get into the conversation about are we curing things the right way. And the first one is, understanding just the mission of the organization. Now, the federal government has lots of different missions. And so for sure, there's not one size that fits all there. Even in a company like General Motors or Microsoft or VMware, or even the Walt Disney Company that I had the pleasure of working at, each of those organizations has a bunch of different missions, and the technology and the things that those organizations want to procure, vary a lot depending on the mission. The salvation, I think, in each of those cases, and I'll think also for the federal government, is to have a framework and an architecture that is agreed upon by the mission leaders. And I don't want to underemphasize that architecture question at all, because I think it's the single most important thing. The architecture will define, what are the pieces that you need, how those pieces fit together, and helps answer the question, do I need a value-added reseller, or is this going to be a mission-led activity, and a whole bunch of other things. One of the things that is always a trade-off is the three variables when it comes to trying to do anything, and these are speed, cost, and scope. And we've seen projects that work pretty well because they get that balance right, and we've seen things that don't work well when one of those is sacrificed in favor of the others. And so one of the questions that I think both procurement people and mission leaders need to address is, understanding the architecture, understanding the mission, what is the most appropriate thing for us in the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And there I'll agree with Michelle, it depends. There's no single answer that I found that works there. So let me kind of pause there. Add one more thing, though, which is, and I'm sure the subject of AI is going to come up somewhere in the conversation here, but we've been living in a world where it's been a software-defined world for many years now when it comes to systems architecture and so on. I think we're transitioning now to an AI-defined world, and that's going to require a lot of adjustments that we didn't have to consider when we made the transition from, physical defined world to software-defined world, now AI-defined world. So let me pause there.
Thank you. That's great. And we can talk with Professor Tillipman about AI and its impacts on VARs and resellers. Jessica?
Thank you, Rich, and thank you to the Brony Center for including me today. I'm happy to be here. So before when we were preparing for this presentation today, we were asked whether VARs and resellers added value. And so the question that I reframed it as is, has the government built an operational method for deciding whether they do? And my answer is no. So the FAR doesn't define VAR or reseller, but it does define added value. And the challenge we have with that is a challenge we have with many clauses these days in the transforming way we're buying technology, whether we're buying artificial intelligence, among other things. But the marketplace has shifted, and some of the definitions that we have haven't quite caught up. And so we have the definition of added value, but it draws from examples that describe kind of traditional supply chain issues, which doesn't necessarily reflect some of the concerns that we have today. And this is a concern I have with a lot of the way things are defined, including even, we'll talk about it today, the draft GSA AI clause, which is that it often will point to examples which have a shelf life, or even examples by exclusion, but it doesn't provide what I call a functional test to aid a contracting officer with these determinations. And so it's not an analytical framework for where we are today. And I like to use the comparative fair and reasonable, which is also contextual and fact sensitive, like many of the things we're discussing, but it doesn't leave the CEO in the dark about determining any of these things. It applies a discipline, an analytical framework for making this judgment. And so this is going to become even more consequential now that we've moved into this universe of fixed price under the new executive order and its implementation. A lot of these determinations have to be made up front and create a judgment before even signing a contract about what value is in these contexts. And so to me, this is becoming even more challenging. And it's happening at a time when we're expecting contracting officers to do more with less. And you find in that executive order, and I'm sorry just to detract from this, what it does is it does direct training and for DAU and FAI to create training for fixed price contracting, but it's not training on minimizing improper exceptions or improving the selection of contract type. It's designed to minimize exceptions to fixed price contracting. And it also doesn't mandate additional training in things like intermediary value, allocating lifecycle risk, or even pricing portability and exit. So many of the factors that we would use in a functional test to determine value are not part of that training apparatus, or at least not nominally through this executive order. And so the challenge we have right now, too, is the way that we're buying some of these technologies and other things in emerging commercial markets might have weaker comparable sales data. They might have promotional pricing, a la GSA's OneGov AI deals, and costs that may not appear in the introductory price, which is going to be challenging even from a life cycle perspective. And I think AI makes this worse. GSA's OneGov program, which I know we're going to talk a little bit more, GSA negotiates the baseline pricing and terms with the model providers, but many of those are actually still coming through a reseller, right? And a lot of the information is not publicly accessible to even understand whether there's been value or understand, what the actual terms are or risk from a life cycle perspective. So one of the things after reading this excellent report that I thought of was we need to really start rethinking how we are defining clauses, how we're defining, policy positions in terms of functional tests. How do we arm the acquisition workforce who is already challenged and is being asked to do more with less with something functional? So I argue that a claimed activity should count as added value when it produces a material and verifiable reduction in government cost or risk, or material improvement in performance or mission outcome, when the contribution is causally connected to the transaction, and when it's not already being purchased somewhere else in the stack, especially if we're talking about AI, The contractor claiming the value should be able to identify the function, the expected benefit, and the evidence by which the government can verify it. And that goes to Rich's proposed transparency mandate when he makes his recommendations. And then you can add examples that illustrate the test, but it should be grounded in a test and that transparency mandate that Rich is advocating for. So again, these are all fact-sensitive inquiries, but it shouldn't mean standardless. And unfortunately, right now, I think that's kind of the universe we're operating in.
That's great. Very excellent. Michelle, what is your reaction to Jessica's proposed value attributes and characteristics?
I think that it is wonderful. I do, however, so putting on my lawyer hat, I think a multi-pronged test sits at the fundamental heart of what every lawyer wants there to be to define just about anything. And so the lawyer part of me relates entirely to that. The part of me that thinks in terms of the contracting officers that I'm working with and writing policy for, does not have the same level of enthusiasm necessarily for that as a model, just because when we give that type of guidance to contracting officers, inevitably we tend to find, and this could change as we move forward, we may be eventually shifting culture, but in the past, what we've found is when we provide multi-part tests like that people try to use that as a checklist, and if one doesn't fit, they assume that they can't move forward, and they become either overwhelmed or paralyzed or unable to move through different layers, even if one particular contracting officer is able to see the broader vision and make things fit within the scheme of the broader context. We sometimes see as things go up through different layers and different, review processes, that somewhere it will get stuck and someone along the way will expect it to fit every single one of a set list of criteria. So I think we definitely need to embrace the concept of what Jessica put forward, but there may need to be some differentiation in exactly how we lay that out, which is consistent with what I'm trying to do with a lot of things right now under the acquisition transformation strategy. I am in the process of revamping a lot of our current guides and then issuing additional guides that explore kind of all of the tools in the toolbox, or looking at all of the possible ways of getting after something. So I think what we will eventually put out with relationship to this, if we do establish a framework, multi-part test, whatever you'd like to call it, it will be more than just a set of criteria listed out, which I think goes to what Jessica was talking about with filling it in with examples. So I think we're on the same page, but I think for the acquisition workforce and for contracting officers in specific, the way that we roll it out will look a little different than the way that Jessica framed it. But I'm overall in agreement with the concept.
So Tony is a senior executive in a significant non-traditional and innovative company. If you sat down with an Army or the Navy and they started rolling out this kind of a framework, what would your reaction be?
Well, I hate to say it again, it depends, but one of the things that I did when I was at General Motors was I started on a journey that I think has legs, which was when I started in late '99, GM was very fractured from its procurement processes, especially when it came to technology. And we realized that we needed some standards and some architecture and some higher level direction, which I've kind of alluded to. But we were also concerned about how do we get innovation into General Motors, because it was clear that our then existing processes weren't fostering innovation nearly the rate we needed. At that time, it took us 5.5 years from the time we thought of doing a car till the time we could roll one off an assembly line. And cars are a fashion business. So, you can't predict what fashions are going to be 5 years from now. Or if you can, come see me, we'll go start a new business. And what we realized was we needed to get that process down to 18 months. And that was a reasonable period of time where you could sense what was going on and then produce a vehicle. So that's what we undertook as our mission: change all of our systems so that we could produce a car in 18 months. And it was a whole of GM sort of effort in the car production business. We made locomotives and other things, but this was specifically to automobiles. And the revolution there was, management alignment and architecture to go do it, and the mandate to go do it. So we had very broad guidelines. The project I started was a way of bringing innovation into the environment. So we did pilots and POCs that were sponsored by various parts of the business. And I had only a couple of rules. One, we had to pay the vendor or the supplier or the value-added reseller for the pilot, no freebies. Each one had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And at the end, we said, we're either going to adopt this technology GM-wide, or we're going to kill it. And the POCs could go from 2 months or 3 months or whatever, but it had a defined time frame. And the beauty of that was that we didn't end up with silos of innovation that couldn't scale or couldn't, benefit our automotive manufacturing and design capabilities broadly. But if we found something that worked, then we had education on both the procurement side and on the mission side about the strengths and the weaknesses and so on of that particular technology. And we had a much better idea then of what it was going to take to scale up big. At the end, if we killed something, the only requirement was that we did a write-up of what we learned and were there modifications that would be required to make that thing, whatever it was, appropriate for GM-wide. I took that same philosophy with me to Disney and to Microsoft and so on. And we started looking at procurement in a completely different way, especially for technology. And here's the core elements of it. Assign a useful life to everything that exists and everything you're thinking about buying. And whatever that useful life is, at the end, you make an active decision about whether you're going to replace it or, kill it, one of the two. You have to understand right at the beginning when you're doing something what the switch costs are going to be. We have to get rid of this thing. What's it going to cost to do that? It's not just the purchase price, it's the replacement costs and so on. So we started to take all of those things into account. When we did that at Microsoft, it saved us hundreds of millions of dollars a year over a 5.5 year period, because we looked at things in a different way than we had been. And it wasn't just about getting the cheapest price or the thing that met the spec that we came up with. It was total life cycle costs and so on. So I would say all of this is good, but in an AI-defined world, it's going to have to be fast. It's going to have to be malleable in terms of learning on the fly and making changes as we learn things. And we have to be prepared for step change function increases in everything that we do, because that's the world that AI is bringing us. So I'm a little leery about committing things to paper, that 18 months from now or 24 months from now may be wholly irrelevant if they're too specific. I think they need to be more broad and take this changing world into account. I'll stop there.
Great, Jessica.
Yeah, one defense to the test is that it is purposely broad and designed not to be specific, so that it has a longer shelf life than examples, which I think are problematic right now. But I think the bigger challenge that Michelle's pointing to, and I think the feedback is correct, is that oftentimes acquisition professionals will look at these lists or frameworks as a roadmap instead of as guardrails, right? So this is what we must do, and this is the pathway forward, versus this is just the outer limits of what we can't do. And then we can innovate all through here. And to me, it's all about a mindset. And in fact, for everyone that went to NCMA World Congress, that was a lot of what panels were focused on, is this kind of shifting mindset away from focusing on everything as a roadmap and now looking at it instead of your outer limits to what you can do, or your bumpers or your guardrails. And so what I have found over years of researching and looking at these kind of trends over decades, it's often not about the rule itself. It's the ecosystem around it. It's the fear of protests. It's the program office. It's the lawyers slowing things down. Whatever it is, there's always stuff around it, and an aversion to risk, which frankly I support as a lawyer. We are all risk averse as lawyers, but it can sometimes create a risk aversion that actually stifles innovation and stifles progress, and creates the challenges. And so what we see over and over again is this idea of going after the rules themselves. And in some instances, it's fine. I think we do need to update some of these things. Some of the definitional aspects that are in the FAR are outdated. They need to be updated. We need to provide greater guidance and greater clarity, and arm the acquisition workforce with the tools to make these determinations and not just view it as the roadmap. But there are consequences, right? So we know that when you clamp down on these things because you're concerned about it, we can drive people from the market. And so it's a choice the government has to make. It's that balance between greater clarity and reducing the risk of buying, like a paper trail, right? And also making sure that we're not needlessly driving companies that don't necessarily want the compliance burden, that want that intermediary that may help bring those innovative solutions to the marketplace. So it's a constant trade-off. But again, I think that's why I recommend tests. But again, it has to be paired with a mindset, not a mindset to, and as you can tell, I'm not a fan, train people not to use something, but to actually do the risk allocation, to actually understand how to use the frameworks. That's how you build greater judgment, not just a greater judgment to ward off a certain conduct.
Well, these comments, at least to me, indicate how VARs should be shaping their internal and external narratives in light of a changing and rapidly evolving landscape and acquisition frameworks that are going forward. And Michelle, I wanted to ask you, there's a very strong preference for direct contractual relationships and contractual privity going forward. And what is the Department of War's perspective on whether or not that is the best way to move forward, is to do direct deals that have very significant benefits, no one doubts, but which may have sidebar impacts on particularly small and non-traditional contractors?
Well, again, going back to it depends. So it really does matter what we are trying to ultimately gain from that relationship. So if direct to a supplier gets us what we need and there is not that value add piece coming in from a reseller, then I think that guidance that we have received that says, cut out the middleman, go direct, avoid any sort of pass-through costs or any of that type of thing makes a lot of sense. And the paper talks a lot about, what types of things these value-added resellers might be bringing to the table that would be outside of what we could get from the direct seller. And so when we have situations where the requirement is something beyond just we need this particular piece of software, And we are asking people to do more than that, either venturing off into an area where the software would be layered with other services that would be kind of added on top of that in a anything as a service type model, or some other, formulation where they are going to be, bringing that software in and then doing something beyond just installing software and walking away. I think we do have opportunities for those value added resellers, and we should be looking at those. And then, of course, this goes directly back to the discussion we just had about how do we then define value and figure out when to do that. But I think there's a time and a place for both of those things. And I think the guidance that says to go directly without going through resellers really was focused on avoiding the excessive pass-throughs, and in any instance in which it is just somebody reselling plus a markup, we absolutely should not be engaging in going to resellers when we could get it directly from the supplier without the markup. And that guidance has been in the FAR for a very long time about excessive pass-through. I do want to point out, though, under the current framework, the way that the FAR has been redone for the RFO revisions, with the changes to what was done in FAR Part 12, the freedom to add additional clauses from FAR Part 15 into a commercial purchase has really been curtailed significantly. And so those excessive pass-through charge clauses that reside in FAR Part 15 are not going to make it into the commercial contracts that we've written for purchasing software in the first place. So that's another differentiation that we have to figure out how we're going to navigate through. And I think that makes that guidance that we have been given to go direct to the supplier instead of a third-party reseller more important, because we have essentially removed the clause piece that would have otherwise done some of that gatekeeping for us in the past, where people would have added that FAR Part 15 clause into a commercial purchase.
Right. I think the RFO process is going to be extraordinarily helpful, written by hardcore practitioners that know their business, and I've had the privilege of working with many of them going forward. Tony, you had defined what you viewed as a changing philosophy internally within companies and their basic iterative approach and rapid prototyping orientation. But I was wondering, as I listened to it, that VARs often describe themselves as trusted advisors capable of recommending among competing technologies. In your opinion, how realistic is vendor neutrality when their compensations, certifications, discounts, or rebates may vary significantly from OEM to OEM?
Well, I think, I've had good experiences and bad experiences in this space, and a lot of it really depended on, the kind of right conversation between the buyer and the seller in this particular case. There's the good news is I think there's a lot of data available now that might not have been available in the past. And so it's easier to make, I'll say, fact-based decisions around cost or performance, or, any of the other attributes that you might be looking for. But I think it's also the reality that supply chains are getting narrower and narrower and narrower in some cases. And I worry more about, things like single sources in supply chain where there's one manufacturer of something in the world, or two, and then you don't have the choice and you don't have the competition. And I think that's a far bigger problem that in most cases the incentive problem in my experience. And so I would focus on that a lot more heavily, I think, at this point.
Jessica, you've written a lot about what Tony's talking about, the concerns about vendor lock-in and narrowing industrial base, and the risk associated with large de facto monopolies across government. And You've written about it both in the context of the emergence of AI, as well as from a broader perspective. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on what Tony was just talking about, and how VARs should go forward and position themselves in a way that avoids many of those lock-in types of issues.
So am I allowed to also say it depends? Because I feel like that's always the answer to these things. I think, I mean, it just depends. It depends on what we're buying, right? So what that concentration looks like, and while there may be less concentration at the reseller level, the OEM might be, or the might be where all the concentration lies. And I think some of the challenges depend on how you're buying it, what you're buying. So, for example, we know that when it comes to certain technologies, the government has a long and painful history with vendor lock-in, lack of portability, egress fees, all sorts of challenges just across the board. And what's interesting to me is I've seen people argue, well, the OneGov deals are going to create lock-in, especially the AI OneGov deals. And I don't think that's necessarily true in the traditional technical standpoint. I mean, we're dealing with like these chatbots that we're not typically dealing with a significant amount of integrations, to least to my knowledge. If there are, we're dealing with something else, then that's beyond what I think has been made publicly available. But a lot of it's behavioral dependency, and it's an issue that I have raised concerns with when we are touting these kind of $1 deals, or well below market deals that just balloon after the promotional period ends. It's not necessarily technical dependency, it's behavioral dependency. So anyone that's used an AI tool, or it doesn't even have to be an AI tool. Any type of software, you get used to it. People get trained on it. People build out files on it. The movement from one. I mean, you should have seen me. I'm going to admit something embarrassing here. Ready? The movement from my Napster account. Did anybody remember Napster? It was the paid one, not the one that was free and pirated, but the paid one, to Apple Music. Thankfully, they had a technical solution that did it for you, but most people just stay with whatever it is because it's just such a pain to migrate a lot of those things. That's behavioral dependency. And so the concern I have for a lot of these things is that they're not just talking about technical lock-in, which is a valid issue, and again, depends on what you're buying. But increasingly, when we're dealing with these chat bots or something, we're not dealing with significant technical integrations where you're locked in. It's behavioral dependency. And when people get hooked on it, right now, if you told me I had to destroy my Claude account that has my projects in it, I would weep. I would weep because I don't want you taking that away from me. That's behavioral dependency. It's not technical lock-in. And so I think that's one of the challenges. And I think ultimately, it's a big issue, and it's something that government has to wrestle with. They should not be in a position where we only have one vendor. And right now, when we're also talking about it, and I know we're bringing back to, because a lot of my research focuses on the AI space, and we're dealing with like the hyperscalers, the developers. There's not many, but it's not a monopoly. It's an oligopoly, maybe. It might be a little bit bigger, but it's not that. And we do have much fiercer competition at the reseller level. And you also touched on some issues with conflicts of interest, but I can put that to the side unless you want to follow up on it. So,
Michelle, what do you think of that? The oligopoly, I guess, is the word that Professor Tillipman was using. I mean, is that a concern for you at the Department of War?
I mean, I think there has always been a concern about what she was speaking about with the behavioral connection. I mean, for years and years, we've talked in the services space about, acquisition of services and trying to get people to understand that, you do have to compete the next time. And it may not be that the exact same people that are in your space providing, CETA support, for example, where they're directly in there working with the government people, and they kind of become part of the team. And we have to go in there and say, okay, but you're going to have to recompete this contract. You may get different people. And, we get a lot of resistance historically, and probably will for years to come with that. And it's the same type of problem where, people get used to a certain thing or a certain person or a certain way of doing something, and they want that to remain because that's what's comfortable, that's what they know, it's what they understand, that's the way they've done business for a long time. And I think right now we are across the department actually trying to shift culture in general. And that is one of many, many things that we are facing, is trying to get people to give up we've always done it this way and we want to keep doing it this way. Not just in this space, but across a lot of things in procurement right now. That is a battle that we are fighting, and it's human nature for people not to want to move forward with that. But it is a challenge we're facing. So definitely in this space as well as many others.
Michelle, I have to follow up on that question. I mean, as we see major procurement transformations going forward, and the migration, particularly of the software acquisition pathway using OTAs and CSOs, and these rapid and accelerated acquisition frameworks, which the Department of War has been very forward-leaning on adopting and deploying. I mean, when large O-line SIs come in, I mean, do you think that those groups and those organizations have the organizational nimbleness to adapt to this radically changing acquisition framework at the Department of War?
Well, for one, we are changing the structure of how we are set up within the Department of War and how our relationships exist to the defense industrial base, as well as the non-traditionals that are currently doing business with us, as well as attempting to shift relationships so that we can bring in additional vendors that are not currently doing business with us. So I think that we are very much positioning ourselves in a way that we are testing that right now, and we are hoping that that will work. We are in a place where people cannot afford to dig in and say we can't or won't change. We know we have to. We know we have to move faster. We know that the ultimate goal is to get things on contract and to the warfighter faster. And so we have to embrace every possible method that we can use within our toolbox to do that. And we've switched to the PAE structure from the PEOs. We've, had a lot of changes in the organizational structure within the military departments themselves. Everybody is moving toward trying to make the right change to embrace the fact that we have to change. So I think the answer has to be that we are doing this, whether people are going to try and dig in or not. It's going to happen. And there's a whole change management discussion there that we won't go into, but we will obviously have our early adopters, and we will have our resistors, and we'll have everyone in the middle. But we're doing everything we possibly can to try to set people up to embrace the change and move forward with it as best they can.
Jessica, you had some observation?
Yeah, just one quick one, which is an interesting aspect. And I do wonder what the landscape looks like 4 years from now, 3 years from now, when it comes to some of these things, because I jokingly call it, we're about to enter our "this is why we can't have nice things" era. We create these rapid vehicles because a lot of people often, I believe the FAR is unfairly maligned. Like, I think that it actually has always offered a lot of the flexibilities, but again, it's that mindset of roadmap versus guardrails. And so we consistently keep moving to these other things that we think will make it better without actually addressing the underlying pathologies. But CSOs, for example, I think there are rumors, it's not even a rumor, it's true, there are agencies that are using CSOs for janitorial services. And that's not necessarily what it was made for. And in fact, I think the removal of the word innovative has actually triggered some things. So sometimes we keep trying to tinker with the rules instead of dealing with how do we actually address value in reseller agreements and VARs? How do we train the workforce to understand these and make these judgments? How do we help them understand these simplified acquisition methods that can be very fast? And then we lead to what I consider to be abuses of some of the greater flexibilities, which I think then lead to them being taken away.
I think that's absolutely the case going forward. And it's going to be very interesting. I think in 5 years, it's going to be a radically different landscape. And Tony, as the technologist on the panel, I have to ask you, what are government IT systems architecturally? What are they going to look like in 5 years? I mean, what is put on your crystal ball for us? And how are VARs needing to adapt to bring that value to government?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that are relevant. One here is just on the rule side. I do think that we need a sunsetting provision for every single thing in government that, if not specifically renewed, except for maybe the Constitution and Bill of Rights, that if not specifically renewed in some useful time frame, is extinct and no longer applies. Because I do think there's a lot of things in all of, not just the FAR, but every bit of guidance that's ever been given that's no longer relevant. And I could give you a long list of those examples that saddle our procurement people and saddle mission people and so on. The Paperwork Reduction Act is the prime example of that just should go away, among many. But I think there's another answer to your question, Richard, which is I believe that everything that exists today, we can and I'm specifically talking about software and system, can be replaced in the next 5 years for a fraction of the cost what we operate it, or that it costs to operate it today, because there's just so much capability in this AI-driven world. I have software engineers in my organization that create things in an afternoon that used to take us months and months and months to do at a fraction of the cost. And this AI-driven world that I talked about earlier is very capable of placing a lot of these things. We are going to have to deal with the problem Jessica mentioned, which is, hey, I like the interface, I like the way this old thing works, but that can't be an excuse for taking dramatic cost out of modernizing and replacing a lot of systems and technology that we have today. So I think the opportunity is there. As you know, I'm a big proponent of the government-wide funding for modernization. The Technology Modernization Fund, I think, is one of the mechanisms that we need more of in order to foster some of this going forward.
Do you think the existing landscape of VARs can adapt given that huge technology transformation you just described?
I think they can if given the opportunity, for sure. Yeah, we have to create the opportunity.
If their whole business model is premised upon cost reimbursement and butts and seats, how is that going to occur exactly?
Well, I'll give you an example from my corporate days. I had a supplier come to me. This was when I was at Microsoft, and gave me an unsolicited offer and said, I can cut your storage cost by 2/3 if you adopt a different architecture. And they went through an POC with me using the process that I described earlier. And we validated that they could. And I checked around with their competitors, and nobody else could match it. And I ended up choosing them. It wasn't in my original plan to do it, but I saw the opportunity, and we cut our storage costs by 2/3 just by adopting an idea that came out of nowhere, unsolicited, but we proved that it could work, and we just did it. And this was an idea that came out of industry. It wasn't, based on competitive procurement kind of thing that we thought of. So I think there needs to be more of those kinds of opportunities for unsolicited ideas to come in.
Michelle, did you want to offer some thoughts?
Yeah, so the unsolicited aside, the concept that was just described, that is really fundamentally when we talk about shifting from telling industry what the government needs in terms of we want this spec or we want whatever. If we are using an outcome based or solutions based approach to defining our requirements, that's exactly the scenario that we want to have happen. We want industry to come to us and say, here's something that you never thought of that would solve this problem for you, and here's how we can do it. And so the way that we are hoping to shift the methodology, both for writing requirements and soliciting for, ultimately awarding a contract or an agreement, is to shift toward telling industry, here's the problem, and then getting everyone, not just our traditional defense contractors, but the non-traditionals and even the ones that haven't previously worked with us, to come in and say, I have a solution that you've never thought of, and it would solve that problem, and it would do it really well. And so that's exactly what we're trying to get. I do also really quickly want to mention, so Jessica previously said something about the FAR being very flexible, and I have on numerous occasions in talking about this acquisition transformation strategy said that I am not asking anyone, we are not asking as a department, anyone to really do anything that they couldn't previously do. The FAR has had this flexibility all along. So what we're really trying to do is train people how to find and use that flexibility and understand where it lies. And that kind of connects all of this. So that really, their two comments really drive home exactly what the department is trying to do with this transformation.
We have just a few minutes left here, and I'm going to ask each of you to just give a little capstone note, and I'm going to do reverse order here for the remaining 4 minutes. Jessica, I'll do reverse order here and start with you. What are your final thoughts this afternoon?
Look, I think that these are raising important questions. And if I really had to think about a final thought, it would be that it's all about the people. And I believe that whether we're talking about understanding what value is and understanding appropriate contract types, understanding the flexibilities of the FAR, it all comes back down to the people and the mindset. And I think, what I noticed at the outset was we asked questions, and your report raises really important issues, especially about how do we define value. And I said, let's do it with a functional test. And Michelle, who, by the way, is correct, reaction immediately was they're going to turn it into a checklist, and it's going to make it harder to administer. And that, again, gets back to the people part. And until I think we address the pathologies, or what I call like the issues around procurement, we're still continuing to kind of, which is why I have an article called Institutional Amnesia, right? We just keep doing the same thing over and over again. And I think we're seeing these same pathologies show up, whether we're talking about the subject of your report, or we're talking about new ways of buying, whether we're talking about integrating new technologies. It all still comes back to the people. So that's my biggest takeaway from all of it, and why I think what is happening right now, and we know who's doing it within, GSA, we can talk about Polly and Joni and many other people that are working on these issues, are doing such important work. And so, and well done on your report. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Tony, what do you have to say?
Well, I'll go back to a trick that worked for me in the Obama administration, which was to have a scorecard measure the results that you expected. So when we were trying to figure out how to get clients with two-factor, or patching critical vulnerabilities, or reducing elevated privileges, we just created a scorecard. Every agency was on there, and every week or so I'd walk into the Oval Office and show it to Obama, and he would talk to his cabinet members and ask, why are you low on the list? And that got more attention and traction in cyber than anything in the prior 10 years, I think. And I think in this area, we need things like that, where there's a scorecard about how good, how fast, and that feedback loop needs to be rapid and quick to drive fast action. So I challenge the creative minds in this space to come up with, let's get a scorecard and let's get the measures where there's effective and rapid feedback about whether things that we're doing or proposing either work or don't work, and then quickly abandon the things that don't work. So that's
somebody said if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Michelle?
Yeah, I will be very quick because I know we're at time, but I agree with Jessica. It's about the people. I agree that we have to measure, and setting those metrics and figuring out how to organize that scorecard is always a huge challenge, but it is something we have to do. But I think the most important thing is having discussions like this and continuing that dialogue so that we continue to learn from each other and people continue to think through these problems and we continue to innovate and move forward with what we're doing. So the biggest takeaway, I think, is for me that we need to continue to have these dialogues and these conversations so we can continue to grow.
Well, on behalf of the Baroni Center, I want to extend our thanks for your taking the time on this beautiful summer afternoon to share your thoughts with us about the challenges confronting VARs and resellers in the emerging federal landscape. Michelle, Tony, Jessica, thank you so much for your time, and we very much appreciate it. We're going to take a brief break now and convene our panel 2 here in short order. So again, thank you so much, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue. Have a great afternoon.